official work session. So we are calling the meeting to order. And at this point, the only item on our agenda is our Budget 101 class. Therefore, I'm turning it over to Crystal. And we can eat what Crystal.
Yes, you can totally eat. I wanted to introduce myself because I don't know some of you. My name is Crystal Rideau. I'm the business manager for the Nissa School District. I thought it would be a good idea for us to just quickly, I know we're eating, but go around the table and do introductions so we all know each other's names. So if we want to start with Maribel.
Monica Ramirez, school board member.
Rose Salamone, community member.
Megan Robbins, board member.
John Goddard, community member.
Brian Hawkins, superintendent.
Dave Bunker.
Budget committee.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he thought it's free food, so he was like, oh, that's what's going here.
Newell Cleaver, budget committee.
Michael Hartley, budget committee. Dustin Martinson, board member.
Pat Warnock, board member.
Susan Ramos, board member. Jasmine Ramirez, community member.
Awesome. Well, nice to meet everyone, and I really appreciate everyone coming tonight. So this meeting came about from a request from our board chair. So that's how I've never conducted a Budget 101 meeting, but I thought, yeah, that's a really good idea. We have a lot of new members. We have a new superintendent, so let's get together. Hopefully it'll take about an hour of your time. I understand we all are parents and we have a million things going on, so if you have to leave, that's all right. This is just for informational purposes, learning purposes only. Again, as I said in my letter, we won't be discussing financials tonight. I'm still in the process with Mr. Hawkins of creating the budget that I will be presenting to you guys in May. I've sent out the adopted budget calendar meeting, but I also have another copy in the back of the room if you need another one to go put on your fridge at home when you get home tonight. Let's see, what else? I've also provided to you guys in your packets and on the tables, it's our policy DBEA, which is our budget committee policy. It's a good starting policy to read for the budget committee. So I've provided that for you. The last time that was revised was just in November of 2022. And then let's see. I didn't really want to reinvent the wheel, and we have a lot of really good resources with the state of Oregon, and we use Oregon School Board Association is one of our close partnerships, and they do a lot of presentations, so I thought, since we're all so busy, and I'm really busy, what's the best way to kind of train ourselves on what our goals are? And they have a video. So the video, I know it looks scary on the screen, it is a full hour. I've tried to condense it down. I'll cut through a bunch of stuff. And then at the end, so with that video at your desk, it's not in color, but these are the slides that go with it so you can make notes or if you have questions that you want to talk about at the end. And then just after the video, we'll just have discussion if there's any questions. But remember, we're going to wait to talk about numbers until our official first budget meeting in May. Does anyone have any questions so far? Am I doing okay?
Crystal, are
yes.
you doing okay?
Oh, okay. No, thanks, Dustin. It's hard. I'm not a teacher. I'm not up in front of people every day, so it's out of my realm. But, so these are, forgive me, these are two OSBA members putting on this presentation. I don't remember their name, but the information is more important. So, let me just start this, and please feel free to continue eating.
So today's outcomes, we really want to make sure that we are understanding a little bit of the history of school, of the state school fund in Oregon. I think it's always important to know where does the money come from and why does it come that way. A little bit of basics about the state school fund, understanding the board's role in school finance, and out of all of the roles, the budget right now is probably the most critical, and that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time. And then ways to work with your district finance. And I'm happy to take questions at any time along the way, so make sure that
She
you're
really
popping those in the chat, and Vince is going to interrupt me at any time. So here is a little bit of a day in the life of an SBO, or school business official as we sometimes call ourselves. We do everything from facilities to payroll payroll, to board reports, to working on our state school fund payment, special ed. We're brought into all sorts of leadership meetings and how to plan for things. So this is just a little blip in our universe. What I always say is I start my day with plan A and I usually end with plan Z because it changes. Just like your principals, your administrators, your teachers, there's always interruptions and things that happen. Same thing with a school business official. All right, a little bit about history of school finance in Oregon. Has anybody ever heard of Measure 5 before? I'm assuming some of you are nodding your heads. In November, Vince has, I would think, thanks for giving me the hands up.
You're welcome.
In November of 1990, Oregon voters passed Measure 5, which limited the total tax on each property in the state to 1.5% of the property's real market value. That's a lot of words in there, but basically what it did is it shifted the responsibility of funding public education to the state from the local level. Usually what used to happen is all the taxes would come in, the property taxes, and that's what was used to pay for the majority of education. It wasn't the majority of the money coming from the state. Measure 5 was a constitutional amendment. It did a phased-in approach, and when it was fully implemented in the 95-96 school year or fiscal year, Measure 5 cut property taxes on average 51% from their 1990 to 91 levels. So that was a huge shift in that. The problem with this was that we didn't necessarily have a great backup. So it provided some budgetary constraints. We all of a sudden had a funding system that wasn't necessarily, that forced the districts to rely more on state funding, which was not stable at the time. It increased our dependency on state funding, even though we were going through different recessions. And so some of you may have remembered that this is a time where we had started to see some reductions. We had a lot of budgetary cuts, program reductions. And one of the things that started being an issue, which I always think is interesting that they highlight, is that there was challenges in facility maintenance and that seems to be an ongoing trend that we are seeing even today, that there's an ongoing challenge of how we manage maintaining all of our school system, all of our school buildings that we have across the state.
Jackie, as you're switching slides, you know, speaking as a school business official, you know, local resources seem to be pretty.
Okay,
Just
skipping ahead.
a little bit.
I think it's really important, and I know this sounds boring, but for us to understand what laws were passed within Oregon, this is all the way from the 90s, and this is how legislation changed, how schools are now funded, and how we're getting to the state school fund. And I'm sorry if it's boring, but I think it's just important for us to all understand how we've gotten to where we are today. So skipping a little bit, because we want to talk about Measure 47 next. Now I'm not doing so well, Dustin.
1997, and I love that passed, and it imposed some strict limitations on property taxes, and it started capping the property values at 1995 levels, and then built in annual increases to make sure that things were not jumping too far, too high. We weren't seeing 10% increases. I think the overall goal was to limit property taxes, which again has continued to shift funding from the local level to the state level. Then the next phase of all of this fund process was Measure 50, which came in 1997. And I like the year 1997. That was the year I graduated from high school, so I don't remember all of this, but I have learned it. And thinking as a kid, I don't remember all of these budget constraints in schools. I still think back to all of the things And that's always our goal, that kids are not, don't see the impact of it. They're there at school, they're having a great time, they are learning, they have the things that they need to get a great education in the state of Oregon. But as a student, even in high school, I wasn't brought into these discussions or even necessarily remembered it. So I always think it's important to say what happens at our level is not necessarily what we want our kids talking about. So Measure 5, the big thing was it clarified some of the language from Measure 47, and it created a permanent tax rate. And the reason I want to talk about this is because the permanent tax rate, even though it's a permanent tax rate, is part of the annual budget process that we will discuss a little bit later. But every district and every ESD has a permanent tax rate. I can still tell you that at the last ESD I worked at, my permanent tax rate was 0.3046 for $1,000 of assessed value. There are numbers that get stuck in our head because we are business officials, we like numbers. But every single district and every single ESD has a different rate. And there's a whole formula and calculation that went into that we're not going to talk about today. Because I'm not trying to put you to sleep, I'm trying to keep you interested in school finance. Some of the other provisions is that it limited the bonded debt requirement to have a 50% voter turnout. And it also gave us some options of being able to create a local option tax. All right, so with all of the changes with property tax collections, the legislature at the time created the state school fund, and it's very similar to what we are currently doing now. So it was established to provide a stable and reliable source of funding in Oregon. It includes an equalization formula to allocate revenue to schools on a weighted per student basis, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And then since Measure 5 passed, the state's share of funding to schools increased from about 32% to 70%. So overall, the majority of our revenue, depending on which district you or ESD you come from, comes from the state, not from your local resources.
So Jackie, I'm noting that you said that it was designed to create stable funding for schools, but I'm remembering back to the Great Recession and, state school funding didn't seem very stable then. And so can you speak to that, to the variability, based on the business cycle?
So the variability comes in with the legislature giving us a 2-year budget. And so they estimate what, we get an approved budget. I started in schools the year that they took money back and stopped payments late in the year because they ran out of money. So while I always say that they're putting their best foot forward, so are we as districts, but when we're 70% funded by the state, changes in the economy could have a major impact on what school districts are receiving, which is part of the reason of having a contingency or reserves or ways that you can try to still maintain and run schools when there is not funding coming in at a regular basis.
Thanks.
So the latest addition to state school funding since 1997 with all of the latest measures that passed was the introduction of this Student Success Act. And I just want to highlight this because even though it's not part of the state school fund formula, it was the biggest change in funding schools since 1997, and I think it's important to highlight. So this passed during the 2019 legislative session. Each year it changes, and with each economic forecast that comes out, the number's a little bit different, but overall, it's putting about $2 billion into the Oregon education system every 2 years, or about $1 billion a year, which is a big number, and has been used by school districts to do a number of different things. So of those funds, $700 million goes to the state school fund, and the remaining is distributed into 3 accounts. We have an early learning account, a student investment account, and a statewide education initiatives account. And while districts or ESDs, they get part of all of that, the biggest part that goes to schools out of those 3 buckets of funding is the student investment account. And I think at the heart of the whole entire Student Success Act, which was also the intent of the State School Fund, of the equalization, the Student Success Act also focuses on improving access and opportunities for students who have been historically underserved. And so the focus really was making sure all of their needs are met in addition to doing some different things within schools. And like I said, it is not part of the State School Fund formula. It's treated more like a grant in that there's a lot of reporting that also has to be done. It requires a plan, a lot of community involvement. I'm sure many of you have also been involved in some of those community input hearings where you don't get to make necessarily all the decisions by each district independently. You get to ask your community, what do we need? What do we need to serve you as families? What do we need to serve students? And so it opens up more opportunities for communication, which I think is always a great thing.
I'm going to pause there and just, when we go over our budget next month, this school district does receive the Student Success Act money, so that is something that we'll look at next month. But that's why we're listening to this, because we have that funding here.
Oops, I would think, nope, I didn't. I clicked the button one too many times. So the State School Fund, it is defined in ORS. So if you ever want to read ORS, the State School Fund is a great place to start. And every time I read it, I have to tell you, I learned something new. I think a lot of times when we take something in, we are looking for information to solve an answer, and so I'm focusing on that. And every time I go back through and read it, I read something a little bit differently or constantly learning, because it really is a complicated system. So the state gives us a budget for 2 years, so we are on a biennium basis. And in the first year of the budget cycle, so this year, during the 23-24 school year, we're receiving 49% of the funding. And next year, during the 24-25 school year, we will receive 51% of the funding, which helps us pay for all of those additional roll-up costs. Otherwise, what we would do is if the money is split 50-50, we're estimating what we have to hold out in year 1 to save it in order to pay for those additional expenses in year 2. Most of them revolve around salaries. All of you have collective bargaining agreements. You have licensed staff, classified staff, administrative staff, and you have agreements with all those employees, and it costs more every single year to pay their salaries and benefits. Before allocating funds to districts or ESDs, there's also carve-outs as part of the State School Fund, which are special allocations. They're outlined in ORS, so the state doesn't get to just decide willy-nilly just to hold out money, because there really is a plan of what is being held out and why, and it goes to supporting students in different types of programs, like long-term care and treatment is one of them that receives some additional funding. Then it takes all of the local revenue. So this goes back to Vince's question earlier. So all of the local revenue is put into the pot. So whether that is property taxes or your state timber funds, all of it is added together, and then it is distributed to school districts and ESDs. School districts receive 95.5% of the State School Fund formula. ESDs receive 4.5%. So it's not a one-to-one ratio. The ESDs are funded differently than school districts on that. And it distributes money to each district using an equitable allocation, using a number of factors, including students. And right now we have about 545,000 students statewide. And so we each get a per student allocation on top of all of the weights that we may get on top of it. So when we look at the State School Fund formula, so enrollment, or ADMR, so I think of that as the head count. I count as 1, Vince counts as 1, you all count as 1. We are one person, we're one student, we count as 1 ADMR. But then there's all of the weights that go into it. So the weight means, on top of being just Jackie, my head count, you get, depending on if you fall into any of these other categories, you may get additional funding on a per student basis. So those are currently ESL, English as a second language, pregnant and parenting, students on an IEP or individual individualized education plan. Those are our special education students. Poverty, foster care, remote elementary, small high school correction, and postgraduate scholars. And again, if you have any questions on who qualifies for those, they're outlined in ORS. Is there anything I want to say about the weights? We're still limited on weights. So I think it's important to know, sometimes I get asked the question, well, how come you can't tell me how much I spend on Vince? And I'm like, well, Vince could meet all of those different weights, but I'm still limited. The state has a cap on how many weights per student we receive. So if you are special ed and you get an additional weight up to a certain limit, plus just being me in the district for the whole time, that's a count of 2. That's the maximum weights that you get. So even if I've qualified for any of those other ones, doesn't mean that the state is actually giving us money for all of that, but we're still required to fund all of those different services that students need. And so it really is, the money comes in and we have to figure out where it all goes in order to put the pieces of the puzzle together. There's no way for us to track individual student expenditures, because the only way to do that is if we put a little barcode on kids and every door they walked in and out, that the PE teacher got coded this, and then the music teacher got this, and then their classroom teacher got this, and then if I went to an after-school program, maybe that's something different. There's just no way to really do it right now, even though it's been one of those constant conversations. We're trying to find new ways to do reporting and always be transparent, but I can't ever tell you what I spent on a student. The other factors that come into play during the state school fund are transportation. So if you run school buses, districts get reimbursed for reimbursable transportation. There's also non-reimbursable transportation at a rate of either 70, 80, or 90% of your costs. Part of those are always looking back at what you did last year, because we get reimbursed on actual expenditures, even though we're projecting what we're going to spend in future years. And then teacher experience is another important thing to look at. So the state, when we do one of our many reports, takes all of the teachers, only licensed staff, and looks at their years of experience. And we get a statewide average. So I'm going to use round numbers and say if our statewide average was 10, if my teacher experience in my district is 11 years of experience, I get a positive addition to the state school fund. If my teacher experience is 9 instead of 10, I get a negative teacher experience factor. And so even if I had all of the weights from the students, my negative teacher experience actually takes some money away from me through that whole formula revenue. So there's just lots and lots of different ways that we look at everything that goes into the state school fund. It's a complicated system. When we have looked at it compared to, I go to other conferences across the country and talk about how other states fund their schools, and every single state does something a little bit different. Some are great, some are not so great. I think we have a lot of great things in Oregon because we do already have some of these weights built into the system, which is a benefit to acknowledge that students that maybe fall into any of these categories do require some additional funding sometimes, and we have a formula that puts that money into districts.
And I would just add that on the ODU website, they have that work, essentially it's the worksheet that has, all the counts for your weighted number of weights by category and all the calculus that goes into that. It doesn't show all the calculations underlying it, but there's a place where board members can look and see how their funding is calculated, where it comes from.
Yes, it's out there on, anybody can look at it. You can look at monthly payments, you can look at how we calculate what they actually get through the formula, you can look at all their individual weights, lots of information out there, and it is a public website, everybody's able to access it. So this gets to a little bit more of also what Vince had asked earlier, in that we are constantly looking at 3 fiscal years at all times. And so even in this year, so I'm currently in 23-24, yet already I'm still trying to balance and reconcile and make sure the state is reconciling fiscal year 22-23, and I've already had to turn in a report to project my 24-25. And so at any point in time, we really are constantly looking at 3 fiscal years. I'm looking at 22-23. The state doesn't give us our final payment until all of the data has been finalized. So the data is all of the things that go into the state school fund formula. So all of the student reports get reported, and those get finalized and verified that all of the numbers are correct. And then the other piece is with our audits. And so we look at all of the expenditures have to be finalized and audited before we turn those into ODE. They were due January 3rd, I think, this year because of the holiday fell on a weekend. They're usually right around the January 1st of every year. But when we submit those, then ODE has to rebalance everything to say, do we have all of the actual data now? And then we get a final payment for that in May of this year. So in May of 24, I get a final payment for the work that we did in fiscal year 22-23. It's not always a positive payment. If they overpay us, they're going to take money back from us. And that comes out in our last payment in May that we get for this year. And so while we say that we are estimating our state school fund and everything that's happening this year, I reconciled last year to all of my data, but I don't know how close all the other 197 other school districts were in accurately reporting all of their information. And so sometimes this is where we see a large change in fund balances because the state doesn't necessarily give us our estimate for that May payment until late. So we won't get it till late April usually is when we start seeing that first estimate. And if we see something majorly wrong, we have an opportunity to reach out to them to see if there's any corrections that need to be made. But there are times when I've been 100% right on everything and I've got an extra $600,000 payment that I was not anticipating. And making sure that you're always communicating that with your school board ahead of time, or this is why. This is what we predicted. These are all of the estimates and changes that we made. We were 100% right, but I don't have all of that data to be able to tell you what all the other 196 other school districts were doing. And so this is where that fluctuation happens. It also can negatively impact your fund balance. If you were all of a sudden not anticipating it and they took $600,000 away from you, then you have a shift in the other way. And by the time we reach this payment in May, my budget's already pretty much done. And you don't really get to make any changes for that for moving forward until you next year are rebalancing and you figure out what that does, but your adopted budget may not change much after that.
So I have a walking question, and I just want to remember folks on the call, still waiting to get some questions coming in, and, so feel free if you.
I think I'll stop right there, and so it's really, really complicated, right? So I try my best when I'm presenting our financials to the board every single month to know where we are for the year. Also in the back of my mind, knowing last year still isn't reconciled yet, and we're looking ahead for next year. So those numbers that she said can sound scary. I don't want to talk numbers tonight, but I'm not going to present to our board next month that we are having money taken away because we've received our estimates. So that is a scary scenario, but it's kind of the world that I live in. Me and Mr. Hawkins were working in last year, even though it's over, our current year, and then already next year. So, is anyone confused? I guess the point I'm just trying to make with us learning all of that is how complicated it is. And I can't, I have had people ask, well, how much is one student? I can't, there's no way to give a definite dollar answer because of the weights that students can have. I'm going to fast forward a little bit so we can get through this.
I have here.
Okay.
All righty. Okay, so we've hit a lot of the history on things, and so really, what is your role? What do we need the board to do for school finance? So I would say the biggest job for me is adoption of the annual budget. As part of that process, we impose the tax and we categorize the tax, and you have to approve those as part of just with your budget process as well. Monitoring our budget appropriations throughout the year, and then the acceptance and approval of the audit, which was based on our initial budget, and then all the actual expenditures that we made. I do know that you have other roles like hire.
Okay, that's the process. Members of the board that have been on the board for a while, you see that every single year, it's the same thing. It's always the same process with the budget. Let's see. Oh, sorry. There we go.
All follow the same rules. The Oregon Department of Revenue has a manual called the Local Budget Law Manual, and it is 100 pages of super fun reading. If you ever are having troubles falling asleep, this would be the manual to read. I promise you, you won't have any other problems. But it gives us all the information that we need in order to put together a legal document and make sure that we're meeting the legal requirements to keep the district in compliance with local budget laws. So, a complete budget justifies the imposition of property taxes and making of the appropriations. And I've underlined that word because it is key in some of the things that we're going to talk about here shortly, that give the government its authority to spend the money. I love this next slide. Let's see, here we go. So this is, and Vince, I don't know if you guys still have your OSBA's budget handbook.
We're working on revising it right now.
I love that.
Anticipation for our budget season.
I have a copy of it that was produced like 7 years ago, and this is one of the slides in it, but it's something that I still refer to, and when somebody has a question, I send them to that, a copy of that manual. So I'm glad that you are updating it. This goes through a little bit of what the budget process looks like, and it's an important thing to talk about. It includes some things that not only is the board responsible for, but also things that the district administrative team, your business office does for you. Because I don't expect you to go and submit my levy appropriations to the counties. That's my job, that's not your job. But let's talk through this just a little bit. So the board appoints the budget committee, and I always think it's important to remember that the board, you are elected, and the board and the budget committee members are appointed. So you as a board get to appoint somebody, they don't get elected. We prepare proposed budgets, we publish budget notices. And so part of the notices that we go through can be done in a newspaper, they can be on our website, but we have to tell the public, we have to give the public information. So we tell them when our budget committee meetings are, what time, where can they get our documents, all of the things that if I am a community member that wants to be involved, gives them the information of where to go to access those documents. There's also timelines with all of this. So the budget law manual tells us that we have to publish those notices 5 to 30 days before the meeting. And so on our calendars, usually at the beginning of the year as we're planning, we say, we write all this out. Here's when our budget committee member dates are, and we work the calendar backwards, and we make sure that all of these dates align with the law, and then we also have other people double check them, because the worst thing that we want to do is make a mistake and then have to redo a meeting because we didn't follow the requirements. There's the approval of the budget, more publishing of another notice. We have budget hearings, we have budget adoptions, and then we go through all of the processes that the state and counties need of sending all of our property tax information of what the permanent tax rate, local option level, bonded debt rates, all of that stuff still has to be sent to the county as well. And all of that has to be done. Your budget has to be adopted by June 30th. And the levy and appropriations have to be to the counties by July 15th. And so all of that's part of our process. This is a great visual of what it looks like. I can tell you that this is a year-long process. This is a lot of work that goes into this. The budget doesn't just come together when you sit down at the budget committee meeting and get that document, whether it's paper or electronic. We didn't start on that last week. It is a year-long process and all of the planning and work that goes into this. The budget committee, I think it's always important to talk about the budget committee, consists of an equal number of elected board members, which I've already said, and community members that are appointed by the board. It's outlined in ORS on why we have a public process. It's law, so that we make sure that we have people on our committees to help us meet those requirements. The committee will review, sometimes revise if necessarily, and then they approve the budget. And then when they approve it, they don't approve every single line item or every single number that you see. They approve maximum expenditures for each fund and the taxes to be imposed. So when you as a board approve a budget, you approve expenditures, you are not approving revenue, which I always think is important to remember. A budget is balanced with revenue and expenditures, but you approve and review, and we're held accountable for our expenditures, not our revenue. So the budget committee does a few different things. But first I want to say, what is a budget? Because I get asked this question like, you were wrong, Jackie. You gave us a number and it was wrong. And it was like, well, I gave you a number off my best guess at the time that I had the information. And so I always like to say that a budget is a 4-letter word, and that 4-letter word is not a bad one. It is a plan. And it is a plan at a point in time. And as a person with a type A personality, and there's a lot of business officials this way, we like things to be right. We like things to always line up. We know that as soon as we give you that proposed budget document, that it's already wrong because something else has already changed. And so we're never need to be held accountable for every penny that is spent in that budget because it may be different than the printed approved budget. Overall, we always make sure we're under our appropriations, that we have a plan to always make sure that revenue and expenditures are balanced. But as soon as we give you that proposed budget, it's wrong. And we have to know that in our hearts, that all of that work that we put into it, and this is what it is. But remember, give them some grace. It is a plan.
Hey, Jackie, I've got a good question from your last slide. The question is, what's the definition of maximum expenditure that really you were talking about, the role of the budget committee?
Great. We're going to get to that in just a couple of minutes. If you can wait just a second, I'm going to show you a slide that shows
Well,
that.
question then.
Okay. So, your budget committee, they receive the proposed budget document. They review and discuss it. As part of the legal requirements of a budget committee, you have to listen and accept public input. It doesn't mean that you have to listen and change the budget. You have to listen with an open mind and say, thank you for your comments, we will consider that, or thank you for your comments, and that's it. Remember, you don't always have to respond and say that we're going to jump up and change that number and add an extra 0 here, because as soon as you change one number, it changes the whole budget. And then the budget committee approves the budget once the review is completed. I think it's important to know what happens at a budget committee meeting because every single one of them can be very, very different. I think it's important, if I were to think, what do I want to hear at a budget committee meeting? I don't necessarily care what I'm spending in supplies in the kindergarten classroom at school A. What I want to know is, does my budget meet my goals and strategic plan that the board developed? I want to understand the assumptions that went into building the budget. And I say assumptions because, again, we're making a plan. We often are building a budget. Many of you may be in the middle of negotiations, yet the budget has to be done. And so there are assumptions that are put in the budget in order to make it balanced, to say this is what we've put in for X number of staff with X% COLA, and here's how our budget is balanced. What are those assumptions that we may have used to build the budget? I want to understand what are some of the highlights, what are additions or some changes that we made in the budget, because there's always something that changes, right? If I had a new initiative in our district that we were putting, a lot more focus in every third grader is reading at grade level, you may see additional staff at the early elementary level, and this is why it meets this goal here that the board developed. Any highlights or changes in major contracts? I'm seeing some changes in food service contracts if you're contracted out. Transportation, substitutes, what are those big contracts that we have that we may be seeing different things? And then other things that the budget committee should know. So those are the things when I'm preparing a presentation for a budget committee, that's what I go in with my plan. I don't go in telling you how many pencils that we're purchasing because that's not your job, and nor do we have the time to talk about all of those different things that go into building the budget. I also say that on top of those are the things that you should be asking and things that is the role of the budget committee. The things that are not are changing the number of staffing, talking about the assumptions used and the COLAs, because that's the board's role, that's not the budget committee's role. And the board and superintendent should be having those conversations at a different time. Those are not the times to be having those conversations. And if the budget committee brings that up, we can always say that, the board and the superintendent have worked together with the business office, and there are many reasons that go into those assumptions to be able to explain them. I've also been asked detailed questions like, how much are we spending on football uniforms? Well, that's not necessarily at my fingertips when I'm giving a budget presentation, nor is it necessarily the role of the budget committee, because that's part of the district plan. That's all the management of your superintendent down to your principals, athletic directors, business office, and how we meet and fund all of those different things that go in there. And I used to say, well, we have a uniform replacement schedule between all of the different sports at all the different levels. And it's more information that we can fit in this budget. So making sure that we know which questions to ask and which ones that may not necessarily be the role of the budget. And it's easy for me to sit here and say that because I'm not your business official sitting here across the table from you. They are pleasers. They really do want to answer all of your questions. So just making sure that we're asking the appropriate questions because we may not always have all of that information. I also think it's important to understand the role of the board during the adoption of the annual budget, different from what the committee's role is. So when I think of the entire board, the board's role really starts at the beginning of the year, or possibly the spring. This is an ongoing cycle in the development of the district goals and the strategic plan. The board, with the work of the superintendent, that's her job, and our budget should always reflect that. The budget committee that isn't sitting in and making the strategic plan for the district. The budget committee, which consists of both the board and community members, they approve the budget. I always think this is important to note that they get to approve it, and then the last step is the board, without the budget committee, actually adopts the budget before June 30. So there are times when the approved budget and the adopted budget have been different. I do not think it is a good process for the board to say, we had our budget committee meeting, we listened to them, now we get to go do what I want. I've never seen a board do that, but there are changes that they have made which have usually result during the year when legislatively we don't have our budget yet. So during that process of the whole budget development, we are still making major assumptions on what our total state school fund budget is going to be. And then all of a sudden they give us a number on June 1st. And maybe that number goes way up or way down. And so if it does, there are times when the business office will work with the superintendent and the board to say, based on the latest estimate that we received, we think that there should be an adjustment, and here's what we would recommend, either adding or subtracting, and here's the reasons why. And the board may actually change the adopted budget from the approved budget, but there's some very specific reasons which are going to result in a lot of conversations and communications, but it is important to know that you can have an adopted budget that is different than the approved.
Jackie, I think that we have 10 more minutes.
Okay, we're almost there. So this has been one thing that I wanted to make sure that we hit on the expenditures. So we talked earlier on the board approves the expenditures. You make the appropriations. It's also what I highlighted in the out of the budget law manual. And so the appropriations are by fund and then by these categories: instruction, support services, enterprise, facilities, transfers, debt service, and contingency. So out of those, you approve a maximum amount for the total general fund into each one of those categories. I can't exceed the instruction amount that is put there without doing a budget appropriation transfer, which I would come to the board as the business official to propose in making for a number of reasons. But this is the maximum that you approve. Instruction, I want to think of all the elementary, middle, high school, special ed, everything that falls under instruction. You approve one number. You don't approve each one of those individual budgets. So when I talk about all those lines and details that go into building the budget, this gets down to a pretty easy summary of what it is and really what your responsibility is. I gave an example here of what two districts look like. I was in the C section when I took this, so we have Corvallis with a $98 million budget, and Colton School District with an $8.9 million budget. The format is exactly the same. It doesn't matter what district you're in, this is what we do. This could have 50 teachers in it, this could have 5 teachers in it. I don't know, because that's not what I approve as the budget committee. I approve a maximum spending allowed. If I were ever to go over it, again, I have to come back to the board and ask, can we either add to our budget, and here's how the additional revenue supports that, or to move amounts in between these categories where there's already a limit. I also touched on this about the resolution to adopt, and then the amounts for the permanent tax rate, local option tax, and general obligation bonds, and this is another way that you could possibly see it as well. So those things that we talked about with the changes in state school fund and how the funding went from local to state has definitely changed, and this is part of that process. In monitoring your budget appropriations, this is what I used to provide my school board on a monthly basis, because they don't necessarily need to know the 47 pages that I go into and the graphs and the charts. Here's my appropriation, here's my year-to-date expenditures, here's what I have encumbered, so what I'm already planning on spending, and am I over or under budget. So as a board member, if this was ever over, I would be telling you, we're over budget in that right now. Either I have a plan and we'll come back to you to do this, or we are trying to figure out what may have got coded incorrectly here. There's lots of checks and balances that go into that, but this is the numbers that I look at. Am I over or under my budget appropriations? This is the number one thing the board should be looking at when you review your monthly financial reports.
I hope that looks familiar to some people in the room, because this is what I provide the board every month when I give my presentation. We're almost done, so one more clip I wanted to show.
And then the last thing that I want to highlight is how to work with your finance team. They are a great team. You always recommend, though, we always recommend you start with the superintendent. We are here to support you. We are here to provide information as you need it. But I think it's always important to remember that you are the superintendent's boss and you're not the business official's boss. And so unless you've all had a conversation and you have something else worked out with your district, that you always start with the superintendent. And if additional information is needed, or that a question is asked during a meeting that we don't know, make sure that you're okay with hearing, I'm not sure about that, but I can find the information and I will get back to you. The last thing that we want to do is tell you a wrong number, because we have a million numbers running through our heads, and sometimes we could get those numbers mixed up. So it's always important to provide correct information, not necessarily guessing and hoping we get it right in the meeting. And my last thing is to make sure that the request is wanted or needed by the whole board. If we were, as business officials, to meet every single question and need that we've ever been asked, we would do nothing but just answer questions. And while we're happy to do that, the board acts as a whole body and not necessarily individual members. And so the information we provide is trying to always meet the information needed for the whole board.
Ta-da! Let me see my last plug. So, really this has been one of the best training videos that I've watched that OSBA has provided. So I tried to cut out kind of the questions because it was a live webinar. But I guess at this point in time, that's kind of the whole process, all a lot in one. Does anyone have questions?
Well, Crystal, this helps explain why sometimes when you give your budget report to the board, you're a little nervous, because there's a lot here. And I will say, my son's girlfriend works from Multnomah County in the accounting and budgeting area. And there are moments when I talk to her that she sounds like Crystal. Very, things aren't certain. So.
that give everyone kind of a better idea? Was that helpful? Waste? Just got dinner? I don't know. I
I got
guess I
four
just want
questions, Crystal.
feedback.
I got 4 questions.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
You knew you had to go under 5.
As long as they're not numbered questions.
So, one piece of history was on the stable funding for schools. When I got off the board, there was a big push to make that dollar a stable dollar. Did that ever go through, or is it still based on tax income and tax out, or taxes that coming in, going out? They don't have a stable number, right? Good. We always, at NISA, we opposed that, even though it was heralded by the thing, and they basically said, don't you want your schools to have stable funding? No, I want the school business to be conducted as much as the business that I run is. If I have short change, then I need, the school needs to be short change too. I mean, you can't just keep going up on school funding and not have the money to pay for it. So I'm glad that didn't go through. PILT goes where?
What's that?
The PILT goes where? They talked about all of the different fundings, PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, like the government pays for the counties and they pay it to school, or to, where does the PILT funds go to?
To the state school fund.
To the state school fund, but under which, just the overall fund, or does it go under which category?
Let me pull my budget right now.
I'm sorry, I should know that answer, but I don't, I just.
You're okay. Oh, Dave, I knew you'd do this. So, hopefully I'm understanding your question, but like our local property taxes that we receive, that's considered local funding, so that comes in under, and we'll learn about this, or we can talk about it right now, our account codes, our function code 1000, that's our local property tax. But then our state school fund comes in that's considered state revenue. And so that's coded differently, but it's still both revenue.
So,
Does that make sense?
yes,
Okay,
so the PILT is categorized the same way as any other property tax, as far as dollar wise, based on 1,000.
Do you see
What you're telling me?
Right there?
1 second.
I'm not sure, but I can find out that information for you, Dave. So that-
I think I've said that to Dave before a lot.
Okay.
Before I misspeak, Mr. Bunker. We find out.
Oh, that's fine, okay, it's really not that important, I was just curious.
Well,
When
no,
that
but we should
came
all
up, thinking,
understand,
okay, does payment in lieu of taxes go the same thing as property tax? Is it the same rate, same funding? I don't know, just curious.
Okay,
Okay, in transportation reimbursement, is it Oregon only? Miles, Oregon only?
For field trips and those kind of.
Yeah, is
So
it,
field trips would be the only one, yeah, it's Oregon only.
it's Oregon only, so if we go to Boise Zoo, we don't get, okay. And the other thing, on that same page, what is NISA's weighted, teacher weighted? Do we know? Does teacher weighted experience, do we know what it is?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I can get it for you.
So teachers that are taught 33 years should stay in PE.
Well, yeah, well, yeah, unless you're double dipping, and that's one other story. And the last one I have is, if payment is based on ADMR, correct? And weighted ADMR, correct. I'm sorry, I should have said that, because I didn't write that down.
Never paid attention.
So on the weighted ADMR, do we still do a number in December? Because I remember third year I was on the board, we didn't have any money in April, May, and June, because we had miscalculated our weighted ADMR. 2 years later, they took all of our funding on April, May, and
Yes,
June away.
and we actually have an expert on state reporting on our budget committee, Ms. Rose, and so Rose, if you want to chime in on how that report, when it gets submitted, and
Well,
that'd be awesome.
I mean, usually Crystal and I work together on it. And she is really good because she makes sure that it's as close as we possibly can get. But it is a guess.
I understand, I remember when I first became board member thinking, why? Why is it a guess? When you got X amount of kids, you got X, when it's not,
You don't-
I understand, it doesn't
You're
work that way
guessing
now.
that all
When I
these
first
kids
became
are
a
gonna
board
come
member, I
back.
couldn't understand that.
Yeah.
Thinking, okay, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 kids, right? I know it doesn't work that way. But I was just curious of whether the ADM, okay, you answered the question, all but 2 of them, you did all right.
Hold on. I'm looking up our teacher.
Oh, our weighted experience, good.
Okay, so for hold on, I looked at the wrong year. See, we have too many years. What year are we in? 23, 24. Thank you.
So if I remember, we're in 3 different years, remember?
I know, what year are we currently in? I do work in 3 years. 2 years.
You don't have 22, 23, right?
Yeah, probably.
Okay,
Yeah.
22, 23. District average teacher experience is 12.9, and then state average teaching experience is 11.85. So our district is 1.05 positive, so that's good.
Because we like to keep teachers.
And that's another report that we have to submit every single year in our teacher experience report.
That's all I have.
So I only have one question to get back on to you.
Sure.
Okay, I'll take that.
No worries, great.
What other questions?
So in the pamphlet you guys sent us, and I could have totally been reading it wrong, but it really contradicted itself when it said, like, that Oregon passed some new laws, and they kind of said in there that the public has the right to have two opportunities to address the budget, and then it goes on later, and it's like, the budget committee only has to meet once if the board says that. Do you know what that,
So,
I could have totally read it wrong, but when I read it, I was like, well, when is the second time that the
right,
public can
so
address it?
we'll go through this as a budget committee and we'll meet. We have our date set, May 7th or something is our first meeting. And so if Ryan gives the budget message and I go through the budget and everyone's on board and we take a vote and it gets approved, then I have to take it to the board in June. I do that at the June meeting. And then at that point, there's another,
That's the second.
that's the second time that there could be any kind of public comment. And just like she was saying at the end, it's not gonna happen this year because we're going into the second year of the biennium, but like last year, we were kind of still waiting on the governor's budget. And actually as a budget committee, we decided to budget conservatively off of the $9.9 billion budget that was proposed. And then we approved and adopted our budget, and then that budget actually went up. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just curious, because
I know, I understand what you're saying, because when you read that, it sounds like there's gotta be at least 2
yeah,
budget meetings.
but then it goes and says, you could do it in one.
So if we meet on the 7th and we can't, if we don't vote or we vote and it doesn't pass, then we'll meet that next following
But
Tuesday.
that board
We have
meeting
three
counts as a budget.
scheduled out.
It actually is 2.
Okay. That makes
So.
sense.
So it'd be under the same as property tax.
Yeah, it's a local.
What else, guys? I hope this was helpful, informative. That's all I got.
And
Yeah, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate you guys playing.
Thank you. 2 budgets in, right? And 1 budget message short, so we're working on it. I had until the 29th, the paper she told me, so.
Oh, I'm sorry, guys.
Four, huh?
Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Chris?